The biting cold wind of a Massachusetts winter night blew across James Morrison's face as he slowly drove home on Highland Road. The clock on the dashboard showed 11:47 p.m., and the outside temperature had dropped to 12 °C. Large snowflakes fell onto the windshield, creating a blurry white picture before our eyes. The hum of the heating fan mixed with the gentle jazz music coming from the radio were the only sounds that broke the stillness of the winter night. James just finished a long day at his software company. At the age of 35, he has built a successful startup specializing in network security, with more than 200 employees. However, financial success did not alleviate the loneliness in this young man's soul. After his parents died in a plane crash 3 years ago, James lived alone in the large mansion he inherited. He poured all his heart into his work, trying to fill the void in his life. The flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror startled James. The shrill siren rang out in the deserted night. He looked at the speedometer. 45 now, only 5 miles over the limit. James sighed, pulling the car to the side of the snow-covered road. 2 police officers stepped out of the patrol car, their flashlights shining straight into his face through the window. "Hello, police." James rolled down the window, trying to keep his voice calm despite the bone-chilling wind rushing into the car. "Did I do something wrong?" "Driver's license and vehicle registration." The taller policeman gave orders, not bothering to return the greeting. James took out his wallet and took out the documents and gave them to them. In the cold flashlight light, he saw the name tags on the chests of 2 police officers, O'Brien and Rodriguez. "Do you know you're speeding?" O'Brien asked, his voice full of provocation. "I'm sorry, officer. I just wanted to go home early in this weather," James explained. "Get out of the car," Rodriguez suddenly ordered. "Sorry?" James was surprised. "Why? Get out of the car now," O'Brien growled, his hand on the butt of the gun. James's heart pounded loudly in his chest. He slowly opened the car door, careful not to make any sudden movements. The cold wind blew the hem of his vest as he stepped outside. The snow was ankle-deep. "Stand over there." Rodriguez pointed toward the sidewalk. James followed, trying to stay calm even though his whole body was shaking from cold and fear. 20 push-ups, now," O'Brien ordered, the corner of his mouth curling up into an uneasy smile. "What?" James was surprised. "You can't—" 40 pieces, Rodriguez interrupted. "Want more?" James bit his lip, a feeling of anger rising in his chest. But he knew he had no other choice. Slowly kneeling on the cold snow, James began to do push-ups. The snow soaked my knees and hands. His breath formed white puffs of smoke in the cold air. 1, 2, 3. The 2 policemen counted out loud, their snickers mixing with the whistling wind. James felt his muscles tremble with exhaustion and coldness. Snowflakes fell on the back of his neck, melting into cold drops of water. His expensive vest was soaked and stained with dirty snow. In James's mind, an image of his warm office on the top floor of the company building appeared. Where he is the boss, respected by everyone. Where no one dares to treat him like this. But now, on this cold, deserted street, he is just a man helpless before the power of those wearing badges. 38, 39, 40. It's finally over. James staggered to his feet, his whole body shaking from exhaustion. Soaked clothes stuck to his body, causing the cold to penetrate to his bones. "Next time, remember to run at the right speed, buddy." O'Brien threw the papers back at James. "Consider this a lesson." The 2 police officers turned and walked away, their laughter still echoing in the cold air. James stood motionless in the snowy rain. The feeling of humiliation and anger made his body tremble. Not because of cold, but because of anger. He wiped away angry tears and picked up the papers that fell on the ground. The snow had wet the papers, but James could still clearly see the names of the two police officers on the record: Patrick O'Brien and Miguel Rodriguez, Boston Police Department. Driving home in silence, James stopped playing music. His mind was reeling with all kinds of emotions: anger, humiliation, helplessness, and determination. They chose the wrong person to bully. James Morrison is not one to let this go easily. When he got home, he soaked in a hot bath to dispel the bone-chilling cold. But nothing can erase the feelings of humiliation and anger in my heart. Lying on the bed, James opened his laptop. As an expert in network and data security, he knew exactly what to do. First, he hacked into the Boston Police Department's system. Not difficult for someone with your skills. James finds O'Brien and Rodriguez's files. Both had many complaints about abuse of power, but were never severely disciplined. They are protected by police unions and camaraderie. Next, he accessed the security cameras along Highland Road. Luckily, there was a camera recording the entire incident tonight. James downloaded the video, then erased traces of his intrusion. It was late at night, but he still emailed his personal lawyer, attaching the video and information about the two police officers. Lying in the dark, James listened to the sound of the wind whistling outside the window. I know tomorrow will be a long day, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose. Not only for yourself, but also for others who may have been and are victims of abuse of power. James Morrison will show them that no one, not even the police, is above the law. With that thought, he fell asleep, while the blizzard continued to rage outside. The cold Boston night left a wound in James's soul, but it also ignited a fire of determination within him. Tomorrow will be another day, and James Morrison will no longer be the same helpless man kneeling in the cold snow. Dawn light filtered through the curtains when James woke up. The snow has stopped falling, but temperatures are still below freezing. He looked at the clock, 6 p.m. Last night, his body ached from lying in the cold snow, but this morning, it was his wounded pride that made him unable to lie still. James walked into the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. A small bruise appeared on his knee, a mark of kneeling on the cold stone floor. He touched it, not because it hurt, but to remind himself of his determination. After showering and dressing in an expensive black tailored suit, James felt ready for the battle ahead. Sarah, cancel all my meetings this morning. James spoke to his assistant on the phone while driving to the lawyer's office. And call Boston Globe CEO Thomas Chen. Tell him I need to see you urgently. The office of Michael Patterson, James's personal lawyer, is located in an old building in the city center. When James walked in, Michael was waiting with a thick file on the table. I watched the video you sent, Michael said as soon as James sat down. This is a clear abuse of power. We can sue them for many crimes: abuse of power, intimidation, endangering citizens in extreme weather conditions. James nodded, his hand flicking through the pages Michael had given him. I want to know all about these two, every detail. Michael pulled out two other folders. O'Brien and Rodriguez have a long history of similar complaints, mostly from people of color and immigrants, but they always get away with it thanks to the police union's protection. Not this time. James gritted his teeth. I have the resources and determination to see this through to the end. For the next 2 hours, they made detailed plans. James doesn't just want to sue two police officers, he wants to change the system. As the CEO of a major technology company, he has influence and voice. Leaving the lawyer's office, James drove to the Boston Globe editorial office. Thomas Chen, the newspaper's head, is a longtime ally in his charity campaigns. "This is not just a story about me," James said to Thomas in his private conference room. "This is about all those who have been and are still victims of abuse of power. Those who have no voice, no means to fight." Thomas nodded, taking quick notes on the computer. "We will investigate these two police officers in depth, find out all similar incidents, expose the whole truth." As James left the newsroom, his phone vibrated. "An email from your company's investigative team. They found more evidence of wrongdoing by O'Brien and Rodriguez. Videos from the store's security cameras, witness statements, and their private messages were collected legally." While driving to police headquarters, James remembered the humiliation he felt last night. But now, instead of blind anger, he felt a strange calm. "You're no longer a victim. You're the one about to change the system." Boston Police Headquarters is a massive granite building. James walked in, thick file in hand, headed straight to Sheriff William Murphy's office. Murphy's secretary tried to stop him, but a phone call from the mayor, who had just received a call from the Boston Globe editorial board, cleared the way for James. "I want Officers O'Brien and Rodriguez here," James said as soon as he entered Murphy's office. "Right now." Murphy, a large man with gray hair, looked at James with an annoyed expression. But when James put the file on the table and began to present the evidence he had, the sheriff's expression gradually changed. 15 minutes later, O'Brien and Rodriguez entered. They no longer had the arrogance of last night. James stood up, taller than both of them in his tailored suit. "Do you still remember me?" James asked, his voice cold as ice. "The man you made him do push-ups in the snow last night." O'Brien and Rodriguez looked at each other, then looked at Murphy, who was sitting silently behind his desk. "I'm James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Security Systems," James continued. "My company provides security systems to 60% of government agencies in Massachusetts, including the Boston Police Department." The two policemen's faces turned pale. James opened the file. "I have here all the evidence of your abuse of power. Video from last night's security cameras. Testimony of 27 other victims. Your private messages discuss educating violators. Violate traffic laws." James placed each document on the table. "The Boston Globe will report on this tomorrow. I've filed a lawsuit against you and the police department. And most importantly," James pulled out one last piece of paper. "I just canceled my contract to provide security services with the Boston Police Department. You will have to use the old system from the 90s until a new supplier is found. And I think my competitors will be very interested in the reason why this contract was canceled." Murphy stood up. "You can't do that. We need your system." "I just did it," James said. "Unless—" "Unless what?" Murphy asked, his voice shaking. "Unless these two officers are fired immediately, and the Boston Police Department agrees to make a series of reforms to its officer recruitment, training, and supervision processes." James pulled out another document. "This is a reform proposal drafted by my legal experts. You have 2 hours to review and sign." O'Brien took a step forward, his face red. "I can't—" "Silent!" Murphy shouted. "You two go back to your office now and turn in your badges." James watched the two police officers leave the room with their shoulders slumped. He did not feel gloating or happy, just a feeling of relief. Not from having gotten revenge, but from knowing that they wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. 2 hours later, the reform proposal was signed. James left the police headquarters when the sun was high in the sky. Last night's snow began to melt, forming small puddles on the sidewalk. Just like how light always shines into the dark corners of society, James thought. Sometimes all it takes is one person who dares to stand up and dare to say no. His phone vibrated. A text from Sarah. The media got wind of the story. They want to interview you. James smiled. This is just the beginning. There is much work to be done to build a fairer system, where no one has to kneel in the cold snow because of the abuse of power by those wearing the badge. The story of James Morrison and the two policemen spread like wildfire in the media. Security camera video is broadcast on every local and national news channel. The image of a man in a suit kneeling in the cold snow, doing push-ups under a police flashlight, touched the hearts of millions of Americans. But what makes the story truly shocking isn't the abuse of power. It's how James stood up and created meaningful change. The Boston Globe published a lengthy investigation into O'Brien and Rodriguez's history of abuse of power, along with details of the reform proposal that James forced the Boston Police Department to implement. A week after the incident, James sat in his office on the top floor of the Morrison Security Systems building, reading through hundreds of incoming emails and text messages. Many people shared their similar experiences with the police. Some are immigrants, others are students, workers, even successful businessmen. All have something in common. They have suffered in silence because they have no power or means to fight. Mr. Morrison? Sarah knocked on the door and entered. There's someone who wants to see you. She said she's been waiting in the lobby since morning. James looked at his packed schedule and was about to refuse. But something in Sarah's voice made him change his mind. Let her come up here. 5 minutes later, a middle-aged Latino woman entered the office. She wore a cleaning staff uniform, holding an old file in her hand. I'm Maria Rodriguez. She introduced herself, her voice trembling. Miguel Rodriguez is my son. James stood up. Miguel Rodriguez, one of the two policemen who made him do push-ups that night. Sorry for coming here without an appointment, Maria continued. But after seeing the news about you, I knew I had to meet you. James was silent, waiting. Maria opened the file and took out an old photo. This is Miguel as a child. She placed the photo on the table. A smiling boy in a school uniform holding an Outstanding Young Citizen award. He was a kind kid who always wanted to help others. That's why he wanted to become a police officer. Maria wiped her tears. But the system changed it. Peer pressure, the culture of silence, the way they were taught to see people as potential enemies. I watched my son gradually become hardened, cold, and finally, cruel. James felt his throat tighten. He thought of O'Brien and Rodriguez as bad guys who needed to be punished. But now, looking into this mother's eyes, he sees a different perspective of the story. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive Miguel, Maria said. He did wrong and must suffer the consequences. But I want to thank you. Thank me for not only punishing my son, but demanding change in the system. Perhaps with these reforms, future young police officers will not have to go through what turned my son into the man he became. So, James stood up and went to the window. Below, the city of Boston stretched out in pale winter sunlight. Somewhere on those streets, there are still similar stories going on. Mrs. Rodriguez, James turned around. I have a proposal. We are establishing an independent oversight committee to monitor the implementation of reforms at the police department. We need people who understand both sides of the issue. Maria looked up, surprised. Do you want to participate? Share your story? Help create real change? 2 weeks later, James stood before a crowded hall at Boston University. Behind him is a large banner with the words, Police Reform Workshop, Building Community Trust. In the front row, Maria Rodriguez sat next to other mothers, both those whose children are police officers and those whose children have been victims of police violence. We cannot change the past, James begins his speech, but we can and must change the future. Not by dividing communities and police into two opposing camps, but by building a new system where power comes with responsibility, where police badges are a symbol of service, not oppression. From the audience, James saw faces nodding in agreement. Some people wear police uniforms, some are civil rights activists, some are just ordinary citizens. All are here for the same purpose. That night, when I had to kneel in the cold snow, I felt helpless and humiliated. James continued, "But now I understand that it's not a story about me. It's a story about all of us, about how we choose to respond to injustice, about our responsibility in building a society better." When James finished his speech, the whole hall echoed with applause. But to him, the most important sounds are the whispers of the conversations that follow, between police and citizens, between mothers like Maria and sons considering careers in the police. That is the real beginning of change. 1 year after that winter night incident, James Morrison stood at the window of his new office. Not at the Morrison Security Systems building, but at the Boston Center for Justice Reform, a nonprofit he founded in the wake of last year's events. Snow fell again, covering the streets below, but this time it gave him a different feeling. "Latest report, Mr. Morrison?" Kevin Zhang, one of the center's young analysts, placed a stack of documents on the table. After 1 year of implementing reforms, the number of abuse of power complaints at the Boston Police Department decreased by 63%. The rate of successful resolution of cases increased by 47%. James nodded, scrolling through the numbers and charts. But for him, real success is not in statistics. "What about a mentoring program?" he asked. "Developing well." Kevin smiled. "Last week, we just had 10 more police officers sign up to be mentors for new cadets. And you won't believe who is one of them." "Who is that?" "Miguel Rodriguez." James looked up from the folder, surprised. "Rodriguez? Really?" "Yes." After losing his job, he spent 6 months working at a community center for the homeless. Heard it was his mother's idea. Now he wants to go back to the police, but in a different role, helping young police officers understand the boundaries between power and responsibility. James walked to the window, looking down at the crowded street below. A year ago, on the same path, he had to kneel in humiliation. But now, looking back, he sees that night was more than just an injury. It was a starting point. "You know," James told Kevin, "when I decided to take on O'Brien and Rodriguez, I thought I was fighting the bad guys. But more and more I realized there is no bad guy in the story. This is just people being affected by an outdated system." Kevin nodded. "That's why our program works. We focus not only on punishing misbehavior, but also on creating opportunities for people to learn and change." The phone ringing interrupted the conversation. A message from Maria Rodriguez. She has become chair of the center's Community Advisory Committee. "Committee meeting in 15 minutes, James read the message. "Today we will discuss expanding the program to other cities." On the way to the conference room, James stopped in front of a wall of photos. These are memorable moments from the past year. The center's grand opening, the training sessions for new police officers, the meetings between police and the community. In the middle is a framed article from the Boston Globe, titled "From Confrontation to Collaboration, a Model for Boston Police Reform." In the meeting room, familiar faces were gathered. Maria Rodriguez sat at the head of the table, flanked by two former police chiefs and several community activists. They were no longer strangers. After a year of working together, they had become allies, even friends. "Before we begin," Maria spoke up, "I have good news to share. Miguel has just been accepted into a retraining program to become a police officer. This time, as one of the instructors about professional ethics." The room echoed with cheers and applause. James looked around the conference table, seeing smiles on everyone's faces. This is what he did not expect when he started this journey: the ability to heal and heal. "You know," James said as the applause died down, "I have learned a valuable lesson from all of this. When we face injustice, the natural reaction is anger and want revenge. But the path to real change lies not in defeating enemies, but in making them allies in the effort to build something better." Maria smiled. "That's why we call it the Reform Center and not the Struggle Center." "Exactly," James nodded. "And perhaps that is the greatest legacy from that winter night. Not the two policemen being fired, not the reforms in the process, but the lesson on how to turn pain into motivation for change. Positive change." As the meeting began, James looked out the window again. Snow was still falling, but it was no longer as cold as that night. In each snowflake, he sees a new possibility, the possibility of renewal, of reconciliation, and above all, of hope. Because sometimes, the coldest nights are the start of the warmest dawns. And sometimes the moments that seem the weakest, like having to kneel in the cold snow, can become a source of strength to change an entire community. James Morrison is no longer the powerful CEO of a technology company. He became something more, a bridge, a builder, part of the solution. And for him, that is true success. The meeting continued, with new plans and new hopes. Outside, snow was still falling, covering the city of Boston with a layer of pure white. But this time, it is not a symbol of coldness and loneliness, but of renewal and beginnings. A beginning that no one could have imagined on that cold winter night.